Hey everyone, I'm doing a short video from a friend's house here in Virginia. I want to cover the topic of 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 3 on the Antichrist and the apostasy coming first. So let's bring up the first slide on this. And here we see the verse that says, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed." So is this telling us that the apostasy is going to come before the Antichrist? Or is this telling us that the apostasy and the Antichrist are going to come before the day of the Lord? Or is this saying that the apostasy and the Antichrist are going to come before the rapture? So there's a lot of controversy over this passage. So if you're interested in this subject, stay tuned for an explanation of this question in its full context that's going to let the Greek grammar say exactly what the Greek grammar wants to say. Well, hello everyone, this is Lee Brainerd. Welcome to Sooth Keep and another edition of Prophecy in the Crucible. My mission is truth, truth at any cost, truth above every other consideration. You know, when we know the Word of God accurately, and then we can obey it and implement it accurately. So knowing the Word of God accurately is our number one duty as believers. So let's move into the first slide here, and let's go deep into this passage. We see here, it says, "Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the apostasy comes first and the man of sin is revealed." So this raises the first question. Just right in this sentence itself, does the apostasy come before the Antichrist? And the answer is a definitive no. There's no order inside of this phrase. It says, unless the Antichrist come, or the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed. Now, a paraphrase of this would be, unless the apostasy and the revelation of the man of sin come first. Notice that this is not saying that the apostasy has to come before the Antichrist. This is actually treating them together. These two phrases, the apostasy and the Antichrist, they're joined at the hip. There's no necessary order between the two. It doesn't matter if the Antichrist come first and then the apostasy come first, then the man of sin. That we discover from somewhere else. All this is saying is that these two come together. There's no necessary order between them. So again, I want to emphasize that a legitimate paraphrase here is that you could say, except the apostasy and the man of sin come first. Except the apostasy and the Antichrist come first. So let me give you an illustration here on another interpret. Well, this illustration will help you to understand how this verse is going. Say your dad is talking to the boys and he says, "Boys, the camping trip shall not happen unless the grass is cut first and the garage is cleaned." Now, Dad doesn't care what order the jobs get done in. He doesn't care if they cut the grass first. He doesn't care if they do the garage first. All he cares about is that both of the jobs get done. Now, this understanding where there's no necessary order between cutting the grass and cleaning the garage, or between the apostasy and the Antichrist, this is the understanding of the early church fathers. This is how they took this passage. So, for instance, in Theodoretus, or we call him Theodore of Syria, we read, "He," that is Paul, "calls the Antichrist the apostasy." So This was pretty typical in the early church fathers. They regarded the apostasy and the Antichrist as inseparable. They regarded the Antichrist as the cause of the apostasy. And so some, like Theodore himself, actually called the Antichrist the apostasy. Now, this is fascinating once you understand how closely connected these are, because it starts to change the dynamic of how we are going to understand this passage. Well, let's move on to the next slide. And this is going to raise the second question, since we've already done with the order, we've already considered the order in that sentence itself. So now let's go back and look at the broader context here. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come except the apostasy come first and the man of sin revealed. This is going to raise the connection here between the coming of that day that we see in verse 2 and then that day that we're going to see in verse 3. So what's the relationship between the day of the Lord and the Antichrist / apostasy? If we understand that relationship, then it's going to be much easier to understand what order of events we're going to see in the last days. So let me bring up the next slide for this, and this will clarify the point even more. So we see that we've got that day circled. We see that we have the man of sin be revealed as circled, and we're raising the question, is this a cause and effect relationship? Is this saying that that day is going, that the Antichrist is going to be causing the coming of the day of the Lord? Is there saying that you absolutely have to see the Antichrist first before the day of the Lord can come? So there's some kind of a cause and a relationship here going, maybe. Or is this talking about chronological succession? Is this saying that the Antichrist has to come first in the chronological order of events, and then the day of the Lord is going to come? Now, the wording that we see in this citation of the passage seems to imply this, doesn't it? That day will not come unless the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed. So this looks like there's some kind of cause and effect or some kind of order going on here. And so I understand when people go down that path. But let's bring up the next slide here. Now, I call this a bad translation. Here we read, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed. So notice that I've highlighted will not come. Now this makes it look, as we just pointed out, that the coming of the day of the Lord is conditioned on or follows the Antichrist. But this is mistranslating the ellipsis in this verse, and that's based on mistranslating the verb in verse 2. So, of course, now this is going to raise a question in people's minds. They're going to say, well, what's this ellipsis that you're talking about? So let's just walk through the ellipsis here. Notice in verse 2 we read, not to be soon shaken in mind, as though the day of the Lord had come. And some of your versions are going to say has come. So notice that had come or has come is in orange, and it's highlighted, it's bold. And then this is the day that's being referred to in verse 3. Let no one deceive you by any means, for that day will not come unless the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed. So if this translation had come is correct in verse 2 and will not come if that's correct in verse 3, then there's really not a problem. You can do whatever you want with the chronological order or the cause and effect order. But if this translation is wrong, then we have to revisit the situation. And so maybe some of you are thinking, well, I don't really quite understand what you're talking about with this ellipsis. And what does it have to do with the interpretation here? Well, Let me clarify what an ellipsis is. Here, for example, in the baseball game, our team hit 4 home runs and the other team only hit 2. Notice that in the second clause, the verb hit is left out and the word home run is left out. Because for an English speaker, hit and home run is just understood by the context. If you say, in the baseball game, our team hit 4 home runs and the other team only hit 2, or the other team only 2, then we just would understand, well, he's saying the other team only hit 2 home runs. Nobody is going to get confused here unless they're not a native English speaker. And so all the languages in the world basically use ellipsis, especially in the Indo-European languages, German, English, French, Spanish. We leave stuff out all the time. We don't want to repeat it, and people understand what we're saying. Now, these ellipsis patterns are different from language to language. We don't do ellipses exactly the same in English as they did in Koine Greek, or they do in Spanish, or they do in French or German. Languages do these a little differently, and you have to know that particular language to be able to pick up on the nuances of the ellipses. And when you translate, you have to know both languages very well. And sometimes when you translate in ellipsis, especially from Greek to English, it works out much better if in English we supply the ellipsis rather than leaving it out. And so when we come back to our bad translation here, where we read, not to be soon shaken in mind as though the day of the Lord had come or has come. I want you to understand that had come here is a translation of anestiken, which is the perfect of anistemi. Now, that might have gone over your head, but just remember that we're just talking about a Greek verb that's in the perfect tense, and it comes from anistemi, which is the main verb. So right here we have the root of the problem. If we can misunderstand the verb in verse 2, then we can misunderstand the verb in verse 3. If we mistranslate the verb in verse 2, we're probably going to mistranslate the verb in verse 3. So now when we look at the translation of this verb in the Bible versions, they're all over the map. So we looked at as though the day of the Lord had come. Now in the King James, we read as though the day of the Lord was at hand or is at hand. And this, now normally I love the King James. In fact, I do love the King James. It's the version I use most when I'm using the English. But here, the King James Version is way off the mark. This does not say at hand. Now, when we come to the New King James Version, we have had come. And this is tolerable, but it's still confusing. We don't usually use the pluperfect in English in this kind of a situation. We get better when we get to the NASB and the ESV, where they translate as though the day of the Lord has come. This is actually getting close to the meaning of is present, because if something has come, that implies that it's here right now. When we come to the NIV, we're stepping back into confusion again, because then it says has already come, and this kind of implies it came and it went. So we're going to run into difficulties with a lot of these translations. Now, how do we determine which of all these renderings that we looked at is going to be best, or should we be looking somewhere else? This brings us to what we call the historical grammatical hermeneutic, which is just a technical way to say literal translation. And we talk about historical grammatical hermeneutic because our understanding of the text, we want it to be in keeping with grammar. If we're dealing with the Greek in the Greek New Testament, we want to be following Greek grammar. If we're following the Hebrew in the Old Testament, we want to be following Hebrew grammar. If we're dealing with the Aramaic and Daniel and a couple other small passages of the Old Testament, of course, we want to be following Aramaic grammar. We need to for the New Testament now, we need to let Greek usage inform us. We're not free to just grab whatever meaning comes to mind we need to actually understand according to Greek grammar. Now, it's axiomatic that the New Testament is going to use the words in the New Testament in their common koine usages. There's no such thing as a word in the New Testament that's being used in a way that was extremely rare in Greek. And there's no places where we have a word used in the New Testament where it was not used that way in Koine Greek. Now, words can have an elevated sense, so don't misunderstand what I'm saying here. For instance, when we read the word grace in the New Testament, it's used the same way it was used in secular Greek, the same way that the people were familiar with it being used, but there's some differences. Same definition, but instead of man-centric grace, which is what you're going to get in Koine Greek, or grace that's focused around one of these gods that are no gods, that's different than in the New Testament, where we have grace that's God-centric and not man-centric. God-centric, not fallen angel-centric, which is what the gods were. Same with love. We see the word love in the New Testament. It's used exactly the same way it was used in Koine Greek, with a difference. That love in Koine Greek was focused on temporal things, earthly things, and man. When we come to the New Testament, that takes this common word, agape, and raises it to a place where the world could never bring that word. It fills it with glorious content, because now it's God-focused, it's Christ-focused, it's focused on eternal things. So you can see that words in the New Testament are used with the same definitions they're used in the secular Koine, but they're raised to elevated senses. So this brings us back to the question of the Greek verb enistemi and its perfect form, anesteikon. And we're looking at a context where this verb is used with reference to time. And that raises a question. When Greek used enistemi, especially the form in the perfect, anesteikon, with a context focused on time, what was the meaning? Now, when we come to this, now we start to get some light to help us understand the verse. Because when the perfect of the verb enistemi is used with time, or used about time, or referring to time, it means present, like present tense. And so now this is fascinating, because in the Greek language, when they talked about the verb tenses, if you read a Greek grammarian and he's walking you through the Greek verb tenses, he's going to talk about past, present, and future, just like we talk about past, present, and future. And the word that he's going to use for the present tense is anestos, which is the perfect participle of an enistemi. So that when they talked about the present tense, they said ho anestos chronos, the present tense. Now we also see this word used in the New Testament. Very fascinating. We read of the present time, which in Greek is ho kairos, ho anestos, the season, the present, or the time, the present. This is Hebrews 9:9. We also see it in Galatians 1:14, where we read the present evil age, which is ho anestos, ion poneros, the present age evil, the present time evil. So, and also when we come to the Greek translations, or the translations of the Greek into English, on this verse, J.N. Darby nailed it, because his translation says, as though the day of the Lord is present. In fact, he was leading the charge with Greek scholars, challenging the existing English translations and pointing out, why would we translate this anything but is present? Because when we go anywhere else in the classical and Koine Greek in this era, it was translated is present when it's referring to time. So the correct translation here is not to be soon shaken in mind, as though the day of the Lord is present or is here. And once we get verse 2 correct, which is what we're dealing with, then we can move on to verse 3. And so let's look at a consistency of the translation here. So let me pull up the next slide. So verse 2 says, not to be soon shaken in mind, as though the day of the Lord is present. And then verse 3 says, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day is not present, unless the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed. So notice we have is present in verse 2 and is not present in verse 3. So we have the verb tense the same in both verse 2 and verse 3. And this is the way this is actually supposed to work. There needs to be consistency here. We have an obligation to use the same verb tense in the ellipses that appeared in the prior clause. So if verse 2 is translated by is present, then verse 3 needs to read is not present. We don't have the luxury to say had come in verse 2 and then will not come in verse 3, completely changing the verb tenses. This makes for ambiguous, if not wrong, translations. Now, let's move on to the next slide here. So there's a big difference going on. In verse 3, we read, let no one deceive you by any means, for that day is not present, unless the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed. So this is not saying that the Antichrist is a preceding condition for the day of the Lord, nor is he saying that the Antichrist is a preceding condition for the rapture. And it's not saying that the Antichrist must chronologically precede the day of the Lord, nor is he saying that the Antichrist must chronologically precede the rapture. Now all that he's saying is the Antichrist is proof, P-R-O-O-F, proof that the world has entered the day of the Lord. So this is talking about identifying traits. And identifying traits is a very different idea than conditions. And identifying traits are very different than chronological precedence. So let no one deceive you by any means, for that day is not present unless the apostasy come first and the man of sin be revealed. So let nobody deceive you, folks. You are not in the day of the Lord if the Antichrist is not present. If you can't publicly, obviously see him. And let no one deceive you, for you are not in the tribulation if the Antichrist is not publicly, obviously visible. Now, this is really important to understand this, because this is obviously talking about the dawning of the day of the Lord. The time of the dawning of the day of the Lord is the same thing as the time of tribulation. And if the Antichrist is not obviously and publicly visible down here on earth, then you can know for absolute certain that you're not in the day of the Lord. And if you don't see the Antichrist publicly and obviously visible down here on earth, then you're not in the time of tribulation. Basically what this is saying is the Antichrist and the apostasy are the primary identifying characteristics of the day of the Lord. Now let me illustrate how this works with another illustration. Let no one deceive you by any means, for the zombie apocalypse is not present, unless the mutation come first and the zombies be revealed. Very, very similar concept going on here. Folks, let nobody deceive you. You are not in the zombie apocalypse if the zombies are not obviously publicly manifested, and if you can't recognize them. And let no one deceive you. You're not in the zombie tribulation if the zombies are not publicly and obviously manifested in a way that people can recognize them. So let's connect this now with the context. going back to verses 1 and 2, and I'll just give the general essence of verses 1 and 2. We beseech you, on account of the rapture, not to worry that the day of the Lord is here. And then verse 3, let no one deceive you, for that day is not here or is not present, unless the Antichrist come first and the man of sin be revealed. So notice the parallel here between the day of the Lord in verse 2 and the day of the Lord is not here in verse 3. Again, don't worry that you might be in the day of the Lord. Don't worry that you might be in the tribulation. Look around. So here's what Paul's saying. You guys are afraid that you're in the tribulation. You're afraid that you're in the day of the Lord because you're suffering. I got a bug flying around my ear, so that's why I'm whacking at my ear there. But you're afraid that you're in the tribulation or the day of the Lord because you're going through some severe persecution. And he says, don't worry, folks. Look around. Do you see the Antichrist? You don't see him? Well, then you're not in the tribulation. You don't see him? You're not in the day of the Lord. This is some very practical advice for people who were afraid because of the severe persecution they were feeling that they might be in the day of the Lord. And I want to point out here too that this translation is contrasting the rapture in the day of the Lord. Look at here. We beseech you on account of the rapture, not to worry that the day of the Lord is here. This is contrasting them. And so this brings us to our closing thought here. When we look at the general essence of verse 1 and 2, where we read, we beseech you on account of the rapture, not to worry that the day of the Lord is here. This is a very, very precious promise. Now, I want to point out that this verse here is a run-of-the-mill petition in its full form. So you're going to have the verb of petition or the verb of asking. You're going to have the thing that's being asked, which can be expressed in several different grammatical constructions. And you're going to have the huper clause. And I've put the huper clause in orange here on account of the huper clause in a Greek petition gives us the ground or the reason for the request. So basically what Paul is saying is here, I'm asking you, or I'm beseeching you, because of the rapture, not to worry about the day of the Lord. Don't worry that you're in the day of the Lord, because we're going to go up in the rapture. We're not going to go through the tribulation. We're going up in the rapture. We're not going to go through the day of the Lord. So you didn't get a lot of my face in this video, but you got a lot of information on the slides. And the content on the slides was the thing I'm really trying to communicate. Hopefully the slides will help you walk through this issue. A lot of people get confused with this passage, and they see this whole thing about except the apostasy come first, the man of sin be revealed. So they're thinking there's order in that verse itself. And as we saw in the slides, no, there's no order between those two things. Just like a dad doesn't care whether the garage gets cleaned first or the grass gets cut first. And so this situation here, it's not assigning any order between the apostasy and the Antichrist. It's just saying that these two are they come together as a unit. The word first applies to both the apostasy and the Antichrist. And then we saw how the connection between verses 1 and 2 and verse 3, that they're both talking, the end of verse 2 is bringing in the day of the Lord. And verse 3 says that day is not going to come unless the apostasy happen and the man of sin be revealed. And then we see the connection with the day of the Lord. And we see that connected to the rapture. The church is going to go up in the rapture. We're not going to go through the day of the Lord. And this is why Paul is encouraging us. Don't worry about the day of the Lord. You'll recognize that day because the Antichrist is going to be present, but you don't have to worry about that day because we're going up. We're not going through. So hopefully, folks, this has been encouragement to you. It'll help you understand this verse in this passage a little bit more clearly and give you some tools to use in your own Bible understanding, give you tools to use with family and friends that are struggling with this passage. So anyways, I'm going to give you my adios amigos from here, where I'm visiting friends in Virginia. I need to get on with my day here. It's been a blessing to spend some time with you here. So take care. Just make sure, as always, your eyes are wide open, your brain is engaged, and your heart is on fire. And we'll see you next time.